everyone. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 19th, where I wanted to put some closure onto Invasion of the Body Snatchers and talk about our next film, the very iconic Psycho. So, as many of you indicated in your discussion forum responses, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is certainly our most contemporary film, not just in relation to its date, the 1950s, but just in terms of its feeling, that we're beginning now to enter into films that are directly commenting on our present day anxieties, and also films that have a certain level of sophistication from a cinematography perspective. And also, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a great example of how science fiction can blend into the genre of horror, which is something that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. And then the idea that science fiction sees the future and its anxieties rather than focuses just on the past and its anxieties, I think is a fairly accurate way of thinking about science fiction. Also, science fiction is something that could be possible through the use of science. And certainly with the Roswell crash in 1947, the flying saucer crash, it was thought that space aliens could indeed be a legitimate threat. But of course, from a symbolic perspective, the idea of alien would represent anything that's other. And just think about how we use the term alien when we talk about immigrants. And you can see some of the embedded anxieties within the film, particularly since we have this very idealistic 1950s suburbia presented to us at the very beginning. One of my favorite scenes is where you see the lawn being mowed in the early part of the film. And if that's not Americana, I don't know what is. You know, that American desire to control nature. Of course, it's an impossibility, as we will see with films like 28 Days Later that are coming up. But nevertheless, what I think that we see with this film is that what was happening in the 1950s, known as white flight, where many Caucasians were leaving the cities because there were too many people of color and too many people of difference who were entering into the cities. So they moved to the suburbs. Of course, the automobile allowed for this kind of mobility as well, to have these safe enclaves in suburbia, but no place is safe. Psycho will show us that. And certainly Santa Mira, which is the name of the town in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, is not safe. Mira being Spanish for look, and definitely this film wants us to look at some of the dangers that exist in our society and encourages us not to be asleep, to be conscious to what's going on around us. This is all very deliberate commentary. And I don't know if you noticed that very obvious stop that was written on the pavement in the scene where the transformed aliens are gathering on the town square. And this is very much a image for us to take in, at least subliminally, if not consciously, that we need to stop this invasion that's going on. The home didn't become a place of refuge. It became a place of entrapment, as we will see with Psycho coming up. The television has oftentimes been called this kind of electronic hearth, a substitute for the communal gathering of individuals. And we'll also see how the television has led to this sense of voyeurism, of experiencing life not through living it, but through watching it. Keep this in mind, too, when we watch Psycho. So, we know about the dangers of falling asleep. We saw this, for instance, with Cesar and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and how when people are asleep, they can be controlled and manipulated. They become basically mindless masses as well. If you're familiar with the Nightmare on Elm Street series, you'll know that they also talk about sleep and the dangers that can occur in sleep. And as many of you noted, you know, the political commentary is hard to ignore in this film, particularly if we think about the concern of the 1950s with communist takeover, which is the more common way of reading this particular film, that these alien invasion is really about a communist invasion. Communists not having individuality or not even expressing feelings in the way that an American would, and the dangers of being a uniform mass. That red threat, so to speak. And it doesn't escape me that we currently have tensions with Russia. That said, communism could be seen as planting its seeds against personal liberty and democracy. And of course, that works so nicely with the pods. And the term pod people, by the way, a little piece of trivia that I had indicated in some of your discussion forum responses. Pod people comes from this film. The idea that you have people who really are mindless masses and are not themselves. But as many of you talked about, the broader theme of dehumanization, which perhaps is becoming even more relevant in our electronic age, and this loss of personal connection with one another is just a terrific way of viewing this film and thinking about its contemporary relevance. If you're familiar with any element of paranoia, then certainly that's evident within the text. And I do think we live in paranoid times. That said, not to the level of the 1950s with McCarthyism, where if you know your history, you know that there was actually legal proceedings to try to identify and misidentify communists. In some ways, it was the modern day witch trials of the 1900s. So that sense of paranoia is also embedded within the film itself. The original ending was pessimistic, where Miles is on the highway. Notice the term highway, high, as in being the highway or the correct way. Highways will be important too with Psycho. You'll see that shortly. But not Miles is on the highway screaming for help. And of course, he's being ignored. And while some of the people who are driving by perhaps are those transformed aliens, some of them are not. They're supposed to be the ones who have their humanity. And notice that Miles is not shown humanity. He basically is dismissed, which I think is a very interesting commentary in the term, that even the, quote, humans aren't necessarily always as human as they can be or should be. The test audiences thought that ending was a little bit too pessimistic, so the frame was added. Miles is in an insane asylum, or he's in a hospital being evaluated for his sanity. Note this common theme of sanity, insanity that we've seen thus far in horror films. Perhaps that's the biggest horror of all, is believing that you're sane when you're really insane. And that said, how can you trust your own perceptions and your own judgment? Regardless, the ending was added on that the FBI, which is one of the most standardized institutions that exists, is going to save the day. There's a bit of irony there for a film that promotes individuality, and yet we have this organized law enforcement that is going to perhaps prevent possible apocalypse. And there is this apocalyptic sense now. But if you think about what was going on in the 1950s, this idea of atom bomb that could literally destroy an entire planet was certainly at the forefront of people's minds. So the sense of the ending of the world, which is something that we'll talk about when we get to 28 Days Later, because not only did we have the atom bomb, but we had a new millennium with the beginning of the 2000s. And usually what happens with the new millennium is there are concerns about, is this going to be an apocalyptic end of the world time for us? So we know that doubling is oftentimes something that we see in the Gothic and in horror. This emotionless double is what we're presented with, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the doppelganger effect that we've talked about, and that the monster can be anyone. The monster can be family, friends, or ourselves. Again, keep that in mind when we get to Psycho. And the sense of the uncanny, something that is familiar but also unfamiliar at the same time, which we had talked about with Sigmund Freud, is something that we'll see in this film, and also something that we'll talk about with Psycho. Dr. Miles Bennell, notice the term doctor, he's supposed to represent a man of respect and science. He's divorced, which would be somewhat unusual for the time period. And also, perhaps it's commentary about the idea that the 1950s idealistic version of life is really a facade. Um, and we also have Becky Driscoll, who is also divorced. I think she illustrates many of the changing gender roles just with her attire. Her strapless dress is rather revealing for the time period. It suggests a certain level of sensuality. There's even some sexual banter that goes on between her and Miles. Um, it does strike me that she's the one who ultimately dies, and Miles doesn't. The male figure, the conservatively dressed male figure, no less. This is something that we'll revisit when we talk about Halloween, where oftentimes it seems that what is viewed as possible sexual promiscuity is punished through death. And of course, the idea that the female is not strong enough to stay awake, whether that's literal or whether that's figurative, that the female cannot stay awake to the reality of what's going on around her. One of my favorite quotes in the film, and of course, there's initial speculation at the beginning of the film about what exactly is going on. And one of the pieces of speculation is that this is mass hysteria caused by worry about what's going on in the world. Mass hysteria caused by worry about what's going on in the world. Might I suggest that that's what all of these horror films have been examining, about worry about what's going on in the world? They just don't necessarily directly address it, as we've seen with Caligari, and as we've seen with Dracula, and as we saw with Cat People, and now as we see with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and we'll see with Psycho. But the loss of humanity perhaps is as old as time itself, or at least the fears of the loss of humanity. But I would suggest that even more so in contemporary times, where we have things like artificial intelligence to contend with. But ultimately, this is a film that's viewed as a kind of allegory, a story about either communism or McCarthyism or post-war paranoia, or all of the above. So, moving forward to Psycho, much like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, was based on a novel. In this instance, a novel by Robert Bloch that was loosely based on a real story about murders committed by a man named Ed Gein that involved cannibalizing women. And definitely in Psycho, there is this sense about brutality against female. Both stories are about violence against women. And perhaps it might be one of the more famous Gothic films in class. If you've seen any of these films, there's a good chance you've seen Psycho, because it is so iconic and it also is so modern. Hitchcock was part of that early tradition of deifying directors, where the director is perhaps more important than the star of the film. Think about how we do this now with people like Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese. And in fact, Hitchcock has been called the father of the modern horror film, and Psycho is seen as the first modern horror film, even though many of you had indicated in your discussion forum topics that Invasion of the Body Snatchers seemed very modern. But I think you'll see that many of the techniques used in Psycho are techniques that are borrowed from films that occur after Psycho. The hotel itself, I would suggest, the Bates Motel, which I'm hopeful that at least you have some knowledge of, is a character, I would suggest. And it very much is in a Gothic setting. That hotel is serving as the kind of monstrosity. But this time, rather than having a decrepit castle, we have, the way we would have in Dracula, we've got the modern American motel. And Hitchcock, if you know anything about him, does have a cameo in the film. Approximately 6 minutes in, you will see him outside a store window. He will be wearing a cowboy hat. So it's one of the things that Hitchcock liked to do, and many contemporary directors today also do, is they put themselves into their films. I guess you have the option of doing that if you are directing the film and you have enough cachet as a director. It was a relatively small budget, but a commercial success, and I would say this is yet another film that focuses on psychological horror, the secrets behind closed doors, and the negative consequences of isolation. Again, I don't want to give away too much in the event you have not seen Psycho. It's probably most famous for what's known as its shower scene. If you haven't seen this scene yet, you'll understand why once you do see this scene. It's a mastery of editing as well. Um, and it definitely is a film that upsets our expectations and shows that no place is safe. It also very heavily influenced John Carpenter and his film Halloween, which is a film that we will be talking about shortly thereafter. There is a great video about Psycho that's 12 minutes long, an academic analysis actually, about the uncanny, which is a term that we've discussed before. And I would like you to watch that. I think it does a better job than I ever could in terms of giving you a sense. But watch it after the film. So in the notes below, under the second section, Understanding Psycho, the Uncanny, watch it after the film, just so that you don't get spoilers. Again, it's 12 minutes long. Psycho is 1 hour and 49 minutes long, so you can see that the films are getting progressively longer as well. And thus far, it looks like I was able to find a link for Psycho, but it's getting more and more challenging as we get to more and more contemporary film. So ultimately, we will probably hit the wall, so to speak, where I'm not able to find free links. And you might need to reference the films either on a hard copy through DVD at the GCC library, or you might need to utilize a streaming service, or you might need to actually purchase or rent the films. But as long as I can find links, free links that is, I will provide them to you. And certainly if you find any links that are better than the links that I've been able to find, provide those to us so that we can use them. The problems with these free links is that they're often available for some time and then usually removed for copyright violations. So, but at this point, I believe I've got a link for Psycho. And our attendance question is going to be about that iconic shower scene. Again, I don't want this to go on too long because I do want you to watch that 12-minute film, or that 12-minute analysis, I should say, about the uncanny after you've actually watched the film itself. The attendance question, which will be on our discussion forum, due Saturday, the 20th of October. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. That would also be the time for your journal, too. But the attendance forum question is, why do you think the shower scene is so iconic in Psycho? Why do you think the shower scene is so iconic in Psycho? And I'm well aware that at this point, some of you might not have seen that scene or may not even know what I'm talking about. But after you've watched the film, you'll know exactly what it is I'm talking about. So next class, we'll talk some more about Psycho and also get ready for the way that I cheated. In the 1960s, I chose 2 films, Psycho being the early part of the 1960s, Night of the Living Dead being the latter part of the 1960s. But the 1960s was a time of particular political and social turmoil. So if any decade deserves 2 films, I think it's the 1960s. But I'll explain more when we get to Night of the Living Dead. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And enjoy Psycho. Little story before I leave. My husband's mother actually saw Psycho in the theaters when it came out. She tells the story of being so frightened that after watching the film, she was unable to take a shower for weeks, actually, without her husband, my father-in-law, standing outside the shower to protect her. So again, this story will make some sense once you've seen the film. Enjoy. Take care. Bye-bye.